Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture 5 in the Concepts series, Formalism and Formal Analysis. I'm first going to talk about the elements of formal analysis, the things that go into it, the ingredients, and then some historical precedents for it in order to set it in its context. And then I have a couple slides at the end about the feeling of formal analysis, that is the way that it's cold and dispassionate and not especially engaged or emotional. So, formal analysis is often the first step in learning an artwork or encountering an artwork. Your instructor will ask you just to simply describe the work using criteria like these ones. Formal elements, it says, line, shape, texture, space, color, value, and so on. And you can see subheadings there too, down at the bottom: composition, balance, proportion, scale, rhythm, emphasis, and unity. On the next screen, I have a bit of an introductory art appreciation style video that lists some of those same elements.
We're in the National Gallery in London, standing in front of Giovanni Bellini's The Madonna of the Meadow. This is a Renaissance painting from Venice, but we wanted to talk about it as a vehicle to highlight the tools of visual analysis.
So here's what we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about iconography, how this painting fits in with the history of paintings of the Madonna and Child. We're not going to talk about the symbolism that we might see in some of the animals in the background. We're not going to talk about the commission or who the patron was.
We're not going to talk about the political, social, or economic context in which this painting was made. Instead, we're going to focus on the things we can see. So we're going to talk about scale, composition, pictorial space, form, line, color, light, tone, texture, and pattern.
Let's start with the issue of scale. So here we can talk about the scale of the painting and the scale of the figures and what we see in the painting.
Well, we're in a gallery with paintings of all different sizes. There are very large altarpieces, and there are some very small paintings as well. This is a moderately sized painting, and that changes weird.
Okay, so that goes on. Actually, that's a long video. There are a lot of lists of these steps of formal analysis that you could find online that are used in art history classes and art classes around the world. This one, for example, the 4 steps of formal analysis. Usually, these lists include the same elements: composition, color, line, texture, and so on. Most formal analysis is biased toward painting and sculpture because these are modernist criteria. After you've analyzed all of those basic elements, the second step in formal analysis is usually thinking about how the artist managed those colors, shapes, materials, and so on. In other words, trying to see the artist's process and intentions. Strictly speaking, that's not formal analysis anymore. That's a kind of interpretation. And after that, often the third and last step in formal analysis is judgment. This is also not formal analysis. It's criticism or critique, as the title of this handout says. So there you can see on this handout: description, naming, the first heading; analysis, relationship of parts, which is part of the same description; and then interpretation, and then judgment. These 3 elements of formal analysis can be a useful sequence, but if there is an essence or a nature to formal analysis, it's really only the first part where you describe what you see. There are a couple of different ways that people have tried to classify kinds of formal analysis. One of the more useful is this one, just into weak and strong. So weak formal analysis is the idea that those visual properties of artwork, the composition, the color, shapes, forms, and so on, that those are really good starting places for understanding artwork. Any artwork, your own, other people's, an art historical piece. Strong formal analysis would be if you think that those same elements are basically all that you need for understanding an artwork. There have been times in 20th century art, especially in modernism, when people have felt that formal analysis basically is the entire articulable or the entire meaningful or significant part of an artwork, and it's not necessary to talk about the politics or the social context or anything else. That idea that strong formal analysis is sufficient to understand an artwork is the doctrine of formalism. So I want to say something about historical precedents for formal analysis. Because that list of things to see almost always includes the same elements, composition, color, line, and so on, it can seem as if those are just parts of any artwork, like atoms are constituents of molecules or bones in the body. In other words, that they're actually just objectively there, and they just need to be inventoried. You need to learn how to see them and how to articulate your descriptions of them. But each one of those terms has a history. None of them is non-Western. That should be a warning flag about the idea that they might be universal. And only a few of those terms are older than the Renaissance. Most of those words, composition, color, line, and so on, are less than 100 years old. Most of them appeared along with modern art. And that's why they fit modernism, but not all art. As recently as the late Renaissance, more or less in the 17th century, nobody approached artworks by taking an inventory of their visual properties. One of the historical precedents for formal analysis is connoisseurship. That arose mainly in the 18th century. It was originally a way that white gentlemen, that is, privileged first world people with money for leisure, studied inscriptions and coins, especially from ancient Rome and Greece. Connoisseurship was a way of studying the history of European culture and appreciating it. By the end of the 19th century, a connoisseur was someone with expertise in identifying paintings and other artworks. Connoisseurs could be hired to help authenticate works of art. When I was young, my father had this idea that he was going to buy a painting for the family, and we used to make these trips to New York City where we would look at paintings up for auction. He never actually bought anything, but he hired a couple of connoisseurs because people like that are still around. And they actually looked a little bit like Berenson in this picture. They were mostly not very talkative, because if you're a connoisseur, all you have to do is draw on your visual experience, and then their job was just to say, you could buy that or don't buy that, it's good or it's bad. In the early 20th century, connoisseurs were distinguished from art historians by the fact that they didn't need to argue or write. They only needed to exercise their taste. So that's Bernard Berenson. He's the most famous connoisseur of the 20th century. Closely related with connoisseurship is style analysis that began in Germany in the late 19th century. And that's the identification of styles like Baroque, Renaissance, Neoclassical, and so on, and the study of how styles evolve one from the other. The principal style analyst was Heinrich Wölfflin, who wrote a book called Principles of Art History that's still taught to art history students. Even though he says nothing about politics or cultural context or the artist's intention or the reception of the work, he only looks and analyzes style. He analyzed style mainly according to 5 criteria, which in this graphic are called 5 formal properties, because that's the way they are. That's the way he imagined them. Some artworks he thought were linear, others were painterly, and so on. So I have a lecture that's mostly devoted to Wölfflin in one of the history lecture series. So I won't say anything more about that now, except that in a certain way, to a certain degree, formal analysis comes from a mixture of style analysis and connoisseurship. The categories of formal analysis mainly developed alongside modernism in North America and Europe. Modernist painting in particular seemed perfectly suited to analysis in terms of things like form, color, and composition and related terms. Outside of modernism, those terms don't necessarily fit as well. On the next screen, I have a little bit of a video of a Bruce Nauman retrospective from 2018 showing a really wide variety of artworks. Some of them you could apply formal analysis to, and others wouldn't really fit. So it also doesn't fit postmodernism.
This is versus. I hate, you hate, we hate. This is hate.
So it could be quite a stretch to apply some of those criteria of formal analysis to ranges of works like that. There is, in other words, an historical period, a range of works to which formal analysis applies best. And then as you get farther away from that, it becomes more problematic. But the idea that there is a dependable trans-historical set of criteria for analyzing art is still very attractive. It's very tempting to say, like in that first video, that formal analysis is just what you see. But when you're asked to apply formal analysis in a studio setting, you might ask yourself about the categories, whatever they are in the studio in that day, line, plane, composition, and so on. You could ask, do they apply to this work? Are they culturally appropriate to this work? Are there other words that might work better? And in a kind of an overarching way, you might also ask, why is it the best thing to do to start with what you see? Why not also, or why not start with what you feel, for example? Formal analysis always presents itself as the kind of bedrock of interpretation and the starting place for all further investigations. But it's not entirely clear why that should be. Sometimes it makes perfect sense if you haven't really looked at art much, or if you're seeing something that's really hard to understand, hard to assimilate, or if you need to just take your time. There's all kinds of reasons why it's good, but those are not arguments that it should always come first. And just a couple slides then on the feeling of formal analysis. When you do a formal analysis, you're treating the work of art in a bit like the way a biology teacher treats a frog. You're dissecting it piece by piece. You're anatomizing it, to use the usual metaphor. Formal analysis is unemotional because it tries to avoid judgment. And the result is dispassionate, kind of cold inventory of the work. Sometimes it's useful to think about that. Think about the low emotional temperature of formal analysis, the way that it's a little standoffish. You take your emotional distance from the work, especially in a classroom and studio setting. So in conclusion, formal analysis is not a culturally neutral way of understanding art. It has its history, its prehistory, connoisseurship, style analysis, and so on, and it's best suited to one particular cultural moment, that is modernism. Most of its vocabulary was developed in the early 20th century to teach modern art. So you can, of course, still use formal analysis. It has all kinds of, there's all kinds of good reasons for using it, but it's best to think of it as a tool invented in a certain time and place and suited for the art of that time and place. It is entirely possible, of course, to encounter works of art and describe them at length without using any of the terms of formal analysis.